In 1974, a directive was issued to the female members of a rapidly growing American religious movement, instructing them to weaponize their own bodies to secure salvation for strangers. This was not a fringe suggestion, but a mandated policy documented in internal memos that demanded young women use physical intimacy to recruit new members and extract financial support. The practice was coldly termed flirty fishing. It transformed a supposedly pious commune into an international ring of exploitation, raising a chilling question. How does a movement that promises spiritual purity convince its followers to engage in systemic, organized prostitution under the guise of divine will? The architect of this deception was David Berg, a man who perfectly embodied the traits of a charismatic leader, a figure who exerts extraordinary influence over followers through a combination of magnetic charm, perceived divine authority, and relentless psychological dominance. Berg did not start by demanding extreme sacrifices. Instead, he preyed on the idealism of the counterculture generation, offering them a radical, seemingly pure alternative to the societal unrest of the era. He positioned himself as a prophet, the sole conduit to absolute truth, ensuring that his decrees, no matter how deviant, were viewed as unquestionable mandates from above. To draw in these idealistic youths, the group employed a tactic known as love bombing, an overwhelming and orchestrated display of affection, attention, and validation designed to rapidly break down a recruit's critical defenses. Newcomers were surrounded by smiling faces, endless praise, and a manufactured sense of instant community that made the outside world seem cold and hostile by comparison. This calculated emotional flooding created an intense trauma bond and a deep psychological dependency on the group. Once the trap was set, the demands for absolute obedience began to escalate. The young people who flocked to the Children of God during the early 1970s were largely adrift, searching for profound meaning in a society fractured by war and political assassination. They were entirely willing to surrender their autonomy for the promise of a utopian family. This inherent vulnerability was systematically exploited. By severing their ties to biological families and former friends, the group ensured that the commune became the members' only source of survival, reality testing, and emotional support. As the group expanded and required more resources, Berg's directives shifted from street preaching to highly coercive, covert operations. The implementation of flirty fishing was a calculated strategy to target lonely, affluent, or influential men who could provide the group with money, legal protection, and social leverage. Women were sent into bars, clubs, and public spaces with explicit instructions to use their sexuality as bait. The organization kept meticulous, documented statistics on these encounters, treating human intimacy as a quantifiable metric of religious devotion. Berg justified this extreme pivot through a twisted interpretation of Scripture, claiming that just as Jesus asked his disciples to be fishers of men, these women were called to be fishers of souls, using the bait of physical love. He distributed graphic, illustrated manuals detailing exactly how to seduce targets, framing the act of prostitution as the ultimate spiritual sacrifice. This theological manipulation was designed to override the moral compass of the members, framing deeply violating acts as heroic martyrdom for a higher, divine cause. For the women forced into this practice, the psychological toll was devastating, plunging them into a severe state of cognitive dissonance, a deeply uncomfortable mental conflict that occurs when a person's core beliefs directly contradict their required actions. They believed they were holy missionaries, yet they were functioning as sex workers for a demanding patriarch. To survive this mental anguish without breaking, many were forced to completely dissociate from their bodies, compartmentalizing the trauma just to survive another day within the commune's rigid hierarchy. The scale of this operation was staggering, stretching far beyond American soil as the group expanded globally. According to verified journalistic investigations and the group's own internal records, flirty fishing resulted in hundreds of thousands of sexual encounters over a span of roughly 13 years. This massive clandestine network allowed the organization to infiltrate various levels of society, securing visas, avoiding taxes, and evading the scrutiny of local law enforcement who were often unaware of the sinister reality hiding behind the facade of a quirky religious sect. The physical consequences of this mandated exploitation soon created a new, unprecedented crisis within the communes. Hundreds of pregnancies resulted from these encounters, leading to a massive demographic shift within the organization. The group's primary focuses were forced to change, adapting to the sudden influx of infants whose biological fathers were outside the commune's walls. This demographic explosion birthed what the group called the second generation, children who were brought into a world of absolute manufactured isolation. Unlike their parents, who had chosen to join the movement, these children knew nothing else. They were raised in communal nurseries, deliberately separated from their biological mothers to prevent maternal bonding from superseding loyalty to David Berg. The architecture of their reality was entirely controlled, designed to mold them into perfectly obedient, unquestioning servants of the organization. The environment engineered for these children was one of systemic abuse, cloaked in the language of divine discipline. Because the group viewed the outside world as demonic, the second generation was denied basic medical care, standard nutrition, and any semblance of bodily autonomy. Internal documents and later court testimonies revealed a culture where severe physical punishments were normalized, and where the warped sexual ethics of the adults inevitably bled into the spaces occupied by the most vulnerable members of the commune. As the 1970s bled into the 1980s, the echo of those early promises faded into a reality of intense paranoia. Berg, increasingly fearful of law enforcement and defectors, ordered his followers to adopt a nomadic lifestyle, constantly moving communes across international borders. The group rebranded itself multiple times, eventually becoming known as the Family International, a desperate attempt to shed the growing infamy attached to their original name and the mounting allegations of criminal activity trailing in their wake. For the second generation, this nomadic existence meant a life entirely devoid of formal schooling or stable societal connections. They were deliberately kept illiterate in the ways of the outside world, taught only the apocalyptic writings of their leader. This profound educational neglect was a calculated form of psychological imprisonment, ensuring that even if these children somehow managed to physically escape the commune, they would lack the basic skills necessary to survive in modern society. But the walls of isolation could not hold forever. By the late 1980s, coordinated raids by law enforcement and child protection agencies in countries like Australia, Argentina, and France began to expose the dark reality of the communes. Police reports from these operations documented appalling living conditions and seized mountains of internal literature that explicitly outlined the group's abusive practices. The sheer volume of evidence made it impossible for the organization to continue hiding behind the shield of religious freedom. The cracks in the foundation widened as a brave few managed to sever the chains of their indoctrination. Mothers, driven by a desperate instinct to protect their children, began orchestrating daring escapes in the dead of night, fleeing communes with nothing but the clothes on their backs. These early defectors took immense risks, contacting journalists and authorities to blow the whistle on the systemic exploitation they had endured and the nightmare unfolding for the children still trapped inside. Escaping the physical confines of the group was only the first agonizing step toward true freedom. Survivors often required intensive exit counseling, a specialized psychological intervention designed to help former cult members deconstruct their indoctrination restore their critical thinking skills, and process the immense trauma of their experience. Without this crucial support, many defectors found themselves paralyzed by fear, haunted by the apocalyptic threats they had been fed since childhood, and overwhelmed by the complexities of the modern world. The turning point in public awareness came when court transcripts from custody battles and criminal trials were made public. In his 1992 testimony, a lead investigator detailed the meticulous, bureaucratic nature of the group's exploitation, presenting ledgers that tracked the financial gains of Flirty Fishing alongside records of severe child neglect. These verified journalistic and legal investigations stripped away the group's religious veneer, exposing them not as a misguided faith community, but as a highly organized, transnational criminal enterprise. The exposure of these practices forced a profound societal reckoning regarding the limits of religious liberty and the hidden dangers of coercive control. The public was confronted with the uncomfortable reality that highly intelligent, well-meaning individuals could be systematically broken down and manipulated into committing unthinkable acts. The legacy of the Children of God became a grim case study in legal and psychological circles, fundamentally altering how authorities approached allegations of abuse within insular, high-control groups. Facing mounting legal pressure and devastating public exposure, the organization officially disbanded the practice of flirty fishing in 1987. However, the cessation of the policy did not erase the profound damage it had inflicted. The women who were forced into the practice were left to grapple with deep psychological scars, while the organization pivoted its focuses, attempting to sanitize its public image while maintaining its authoritarian grip on the thousands of members still living within its communes. The heaviest burden of this dark history fell upon the second generation. As these children grew into adulthood and eventually left or were forced out of the group, they faced the monumental task of integrating into a society they had been explicitly taught to view as evil. Survivors of the Family International describe a harrowing journey of learning basic life skills, overcoming complex post-traumatic stress, and attempting to build an identity completely separate from the one violently imposed upon them. The shadow of the leader's manipulation still loomed over their recovery. The mechanisms of deception that built the organization were deeply ingrained, requiring years of painful, deliberate unlearning. The story of this group is a testament to the terrifying power of twisted ideology to override human morality and the catastrophic collateral damage inflicted when a demand for absolute devotion supersedes the fundamental duty to protect the vulnerable. Today, the scattered remnants of the movement serve as a chilling reminder of the dangers of unchecked charismatic authority. The documented history of flirty fishing and the systemic abuse of the second generation stand as irrefutable evidence of the crimes committed in the name of a distorted faith. Yet the true legacy of this dark chapter is found in the voices of the survivors, whose courage to speak the truth finally shattered the silence, exposing the sinister reality that thrived in the shadows for far too long.